is meeting in public session. Now the public phone notice, I'd just like to remind members to ensure their mobile phones are switched off. Today we're having engagement on the work of the General Affairs Council with Minister Helen McEntee, and on behalf of the committee I would like to welcome Minister McEntee back to our committee to discuss her work on the General Affairs Council, as well as Brexit, preparedness and contingency plans and alliance building within the EU. It is important for us as an EU Affairs Committee to ensure that Ireland and the EU are as prepared as possible for what is about to happen, and at the same time as facing challenges that now look very immediate, and that we also look beyond the immediate horizon and continue to work to strengthen the EU and how it works and how we're going to work in particularly after the next month or so. I would normally read out the usual reminder of the rules and privilege, but as the Minister is very familiar with them, I would just like to remind you all of their application here today. Minister, I'd like to invite you on behalf of the committee to make your opening statement, and again to thank you and your staff and the people that work with you for what I would consider the Trojan efforts that you're all making, in particularly over the last number of months, because there is an awful amount of work. I know that you personally are engaging on an awful lot of travel, which is very difficult at times, and I just want to say that on behalf of all of the members, we appreciate the work that you are doing at this stressful time, is the way I'd put it.
Thank you, Chairman. And I wouldn't like my constituents to think I'm travelling too much, but definitely travel at the moment has somewhat increased. But Senators, Deputy Senators, I'm delighted to be here again to update the committee on developments. As usual, it has been a very busy time since I was with you here last in December, not least in relation to Brexit. As you rightly said yesterday, I attended the General Affairs Council, and at that meeting our focus was primarily on the MFF, preparations for the March European Council and the Commission proposal towards a sustainable Europe by 2030. Ministers also discussed the rule of law in Poland and as well as that values in the Union and Hungary. With your permission, Chairman, I propose to focus on 4 headlines today. They are, firstly, our preparedness and contingency plans for Brexit. Secondly, the MFF, Multiannual Financial Framework. Thirdly, an update on other issues discussed during yesterday's meeting. And finally, I'll give the committee an overview of the work Ireland is undertaking in terms of building alliances across the EU, something that I know the committee is focused on and committed to as well. Firstly, let me update the committee on Brexit. A no-deal Brexit would be highly disruptive and would have profound political, economic but also legal implications, most seriously for the UK but also for Ireland and the rest of the EU. In light of the ongoing political uncertainties in the UK and the Brexit deadline of the 29th of March, which is just a few short weeks away, the Government agreed that greater priority should be given immediately to preparations for a no-deal. Since then, the Government published its Brexit Contingency Action Plan on the 19th of December. This sets out in detail sectoral analysis and approaches to mitigating the impact of a no-deal Brexit. The plan is designed to be consistent with, but also complementary to the approach that's been taken at an EU27 level to prepare for the UK's departure and withdrawal. The legislative provisions envisaged in that plan are due to be published this Friday and will be introduced in the Dáil next week. I'll now focus on the non-legislative preparedness measures being taken to ensure that the East-West trade continues as smooth as possible. We are, of course, developing the additional physical infrastructure which is needed at our ports and airports. At Dublin and Rossall airports, sites suitable for temporary infrastructure have been identified and refurbishment work has already begun. Space for truck parking has been secured in both locations. At the same time, plans to advance the development of permanent infrastructure in both ports. At Dublin Airport, existing facilities can cater for the volumes of traffic involved in the event of a no-deal Brexit. Revenue will have 400 additional customs staff trained and in place by the end of March, but they can also recruit an additional 200 by the end of this year. The Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine is implementing the necessary steps to facilitate more sanitary and phytosanitary controls. Veterinary personnel and 70 other supported staff are now being recruited to implement animal and health checks, or the SPS, as are 61 extra environmental health staff. In budgets 2017, 18 and 19, the Government put in place supports to help business prepare for Brexit. These include a €300 million future growth loan scheme and a separate €300 million Brexit loan scheme for business. Ireland is also preparing for Brexit as part of the EU27, and with the full support of the European Commission, many of the actions aimed at mitigating the effects of a no-deal outcome will be taken at an EU level as they involve sectors regulated by the EU. The European Commission published its contingency plan in November and a communication on contingency in December. These contained guidance on planning for Brexit, but also outlined their approach in a number of key areas. The EU has published over 80 Brexit preparedness notices in total. The Commission's contingency action plan emphasises that it stands ready to engage with the Member States that it will be most affected by a no-deal withdrawal, and states that the Commission will absolutely support Ireland in finding solutions addressing the specific challenges of Brexit. The EU has agreed to facilitate basic connectivity in air transport and road haulage between the UK and the EU on an interim basis, and this is on a no-deal scenario. Our government continues to engage in intensive discussions with the European Commission and also with our EU partners, and I know my colleague in the Taoiseach gave quite a detailed discussion and answered questions for this committee as with the Foreign Affairs Committee also last week. Chairman, in terms of the MFF, the European Council had its first substantive discussion on the MFF proposal in December, following a number of policy discussions at the General Affairs Council, which I attend in the autumn. The ground was well prepared by the Austrian presidency, which presented a draft negotiating box. Essentially, this document outlines the key issues which will require political decisions at the end of the day. We welcome that work was balanced and fair, and we see it as the basis for ongoing work within the Council. However, we have stressed that we don't feel that the balance is just quite right. Yes, the heads of state and government also said that the Council should aim to reach agreement on the MFF in the autumn of this year, and again this is something that we would agree with. As Council President Tusk has highlighted, there is still a lot of work to be done to reach a common position. Each Member State has its own priorities, as does the European Parliament, which is also part of the negotiating geometry. Negotiations on the MFF are always difficult, but these negotiations have an added complexity due to the uncertainty surrounding Brexit. The European Parliament election will also have an impact, hence the likelihood is that an agreement will not be reached in Council until the latter half of this year. Since December, the General Affairs Council has had 2 discussions on the subject, the latest just yesterday in Brussels. Yesterday, the Romanian Presidency presented Ministers with the State of Play report, which includes a work programme for the months ahead. The Presidency will focus now on narrowing down the range of options contained within the negotiating box, and their aim is to have a revised negotiating box prepared ahead of the June European Council. It's expected that the General Affairs Council will hold a series of thematic discussions in the meantime to provide the Presidency with political guidance on some of the cross-cutting aspects of the budget, and some which we have suggested in terms of climate change and migration, as well as others, contingency and others. Work is also underway in agreeing the sectoral programmes, which the new budget will fund either at a Council level or in some cases in trialogue in the European Parliament, while that is still possible. Consideration of the proposed euro area budget is also underway. The Irish position has not changed, Cahill. Since I last addressed the committee, as the Taoiseach emphasised at the December European Council, we want a well-funded common agricultural policy. The Taoiseach also underlined the need to protect the structural and cohesion funds for countries in Central and Eastern Europe and the Mediterranean. Ireland, as we know, benefited enormously from these funds and from the investment in our own infrastructure, which was only made possible by these funds in years gone by. In the current climate, we want to ensure the continued funding for the Interreg and peace programmes, which are integral to the Good Friday Agreement and the peace process, which are particularly important to Northern Ireland and the border region. It is essential that we continue to fund other programmes that work as well as Erasmus programmes, or Erasmus Plus, which is particularly valuable to young people. Other examples of Horizon Europe, or which was Horizon 2020, which will support the necessary investment in research and development to create jobs of the future. In terms of the overall GAC agenda, I'll now go on to the topics discussed at the meeting yesterday. We discussed the agenda for the next month's European Council. The March meeting will discuss quite a range of issues, from climate change by providing guidance on the overall direction of an EU long-term strategy to be submitted under the Paris Agreement. They will also prepare for the EU-China Summit, which will take place in April. In preparation for the next EU strategic agenda, the March Council will focus on jobs, growth and competitiveness, as it always does at this General March meeting. We welcome the inclusion of this topic in the European Council agenda, and we're very much looking forward to a substantive discussion at the meeting. Ireland has consistently been a strong supporter of the single market, of removing the restrictions to trade in goods and services within the EU, and in particular we have stressed, and I emphasised yesterday, the need to make progress on the area of services within the single market. This is essential for the competitiveness of all Member States and for Europe to remain competitive with other global trading blocs. Ireland and 4 other Member States commissioned a recent report through the Copenhagen Economics Report called Making EU Trade in Services Work for All, and what it very clearly shows is that the strength of the single market is linked intricately with Europe's competitiveness in the world stage and with European prosperity. So it is an important focus for us. My colleagues and I also exchanged views yesterday on the Commission's reflection paper towards a sustainable Europe 2030. The paper outlines how EU policy is contributing towards achieving the sustainable development goals, where further action is required also. Ireland welcomes the paper as another confirmation of the EU's ongoing commitment to achieving the sustainable development goals, but I think what was clear from the discussions yesterday also is that we would hope it would bring a renewed sense of urgency about this, because obviously the goals were first agreed over 3 years ago now. In particular, we support the paper's reaffirmation that sustainable development is deeply rooted in the European projects, and as again I repeated to the Commissioner yesterday, many Member States, including Ireland, have our own national implementation strategies, and so the focus should be now on a practical implementation and ambitious plan, not general discussion within the European Union. Finally, two important topics which have preoccupied, I think, the General Affairs Council, namely the rule of law in Poland and the values of the Union in Hungary. The General Affairs Council have held 5 hearings on Poland, which took place last year, and the Romanian Presidency updated ministers on those issues yesterday. As the committee will be aware, the central issue is the rule of law and its application there. In October, the European Court of Justice issued an interim ruling ordering Poland to adopt measures to temporarily suspend the application of Polish legislation, which had lowered the retirement age for sitting judges and future judges. Poland has since adopted legislation to amend the Supreme Court and to enable the return to work of judges forced to retire. This move was in response to the interim ruling, and a final judgment for the European Court is due within the next few months. Chairman, ours is a union based on shared values. This includes democracy, human rights and the rule of law, and Ireland has consistently supported the Commission in this matter and in our discussions. In my intervention yesterday, I urged Poland to continue to engage with the Commission on concerns that have been aired, obviously acknowledging the work that they have done to date and the importance of that, but also acknowledging the fact that Vice President Timmermans also raised further concerns yesterday that we had not heard of before, and so we urge them to continue to engage with them on that. The Presidency itself concluded that the Council will remain seized of the issue. The Presidency also updated ministers on Hungary yesterday. As you know, the Parliament referred an option or opinion on the value of the European Union to the Council following the adoption of the Sargentini report. The Commission has since prepared a paper on the values-related infringement procedures that it takes to address concerns about the situation in Hungary. Ireland has previously made its concerns known in relation to issues surrounding the rule of law, particularly recent legislation targeting non-governmental actors in Hungary. Several Member States, including Ireland, yesterday expressed concerns about the current situation in Hungary, and the Presidency promised to return to the issue in due course. Again, at this time, when we are facing many challenges within the Union, it is now more than ever important that we stand by our shared values. There was also a new development raised by the Commissioner yesterday in relation to a government-funded campaign in Hungary, specifically targeting George Soros, but also the President of the Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker. And I think this is a worrying new development, and obviously these issues need to be dealt with on the basis of mutual respect, and that I would hope we would be able to discuss that again at a further date. Finally, you'll be pleased to hear if I could just focus on alliance building to strengthening the EU. Ireland has always been an outward-looking country and recognised that our influence grows through cooperation with others. As we are reminded during the Dáil 100 celebrations, one of the first acts of the Dáil was to send a message to the free nations of the world to ask for their support on our search for independence. The presence of so many of our friends and our EU partners at the celebrations and the remarkable solidarity that have been experienced throughout the Brexit negotiations, it is a testament to Ireland's message being heard, but also to our place at the heart of Europe. Solidarity is built on understanding, shared perspectives and reciprocity. Apologies. It is a priority for us to thank our European partners for the solidarity they have shown to us, but it is also essential that we understand their perspectives on the full range of issues we face in our shared union and to discuss our priorities for the future. To do this, we have strategically increased our range and intensity of our contacts with other Member States, but also institutions. We've intensified our political and official level engagement, strengthened our diplomatic presence and undertaken joint initiatives to try and shape the EU agenda in a way that best reflects the interests of the Irish people. The Taoiseach, the Taoiseach and I have stepped up bilateral engagement with our European counterparts last year, along with my General Affairs visits and other Council meetings. I managed to visit 9 other EU capitals as well as the European Parliament in Strasbourg, and I look forward to meeting with my Latvian and Lithuanian counterparts in Riga and Vilnius later this month. The Government's ambitious programme for Visit of St Patrick's Day will serve as a platform to underline Ireland's commitment to and our membership of the European Union. Ministers will visit all 27 European capitals over the St Patrick's Day period. Extra personnel have been added to key missions and more will follow in this summer's rotation. A Consulate General will open in Cardiff shortly, and on foot of a root and branch review of our relations in Germany, a new consulate will also open in Frankfurt in the autumn. The Ambassador in Paris is also due to make a presentation and proposals to the Taoiseach and myself in April as part of a wider review of our excellent relationship with France. I also want to recognise the very important role that this committee plays in strengthening our engagement with both current and prospective Member States. I'm heartened to see that this is reflected in your own work programme for the coming year, and I thank you for your efforts. I want to thank you for the invitation, as always, to address this committee. Thank you, Chairman, and to your team for the work that you do, and I look forward to any questions from the deputies and senators. Thank you.
Minister, and could I just, before we go to Senator Neil Richmond, could I just remind the members that I have assured the Minister that she will be out of here at 2:55 as she has to take priority questions. So we'll try our best to stick to that, to be fair. So, Senator Neil, thank you.
Thanks, Chairman. In the 45 minutes or so you were allowing to me alone, I'll try and keep it.
I hope it'll be enough for it.
Yeah, no, I'll try and keep it to specific questions and minimal commentary. Minister, in relation to the multi-annual financial framework, the timelines that you laid out in relation to Council adoption, is this in order, or is it a little bit shorter than it usually is due to obvious other concerns facing the Union at the moment? And what are the timelines laid out for the European Parliament to feed into this process as well? And I suppose one of the comment on that is I'm delighted to see the Government putting so much emphasis on maintaining funding for Erasmus Plus and Horizon 2020, but my main concern is that domestically that needs to be accompanied by encouragement and emphasis to make sure people are actually taking up those programmes. I'm strongly of a belief that we are not taking up as much opportunities to send young people abroad through Erasmus Plus, and we need to maximise our opportunities through Horizon 2020 with other partners, particularly now with the UK leaving. In relation to the rule of law, this is something that I'm extremely worried about, and I know we've shared many discussions about it. I note the actions that have been taken and the ongoing work, particularly in Poland, but the concerns I have really relate to Hungary. And I have to ask, what are the sanctions? I know the issues that the Court of Justice can do and the rules that the Council can insist, but if they're not adopted, if they're not brought in, what are the sanctions for a Member State who continuously flout the values of this European Union? In relation to alliances, I think these are particularly vital, especially when it comes to the multi-annual financial framework and other future challenges leading to that, such as obviously the renegotiation of the cap, but also the possibility in relation to taxation. I think that's something that we need to really double down on, build our multiple layered alliances. It's not just with one country or two countries, be it the Hanseatic Alliance or anything else. I think we really need to increase it. I'm delighted to hear that we are opening a consulate in Frankfurt, but I met the Irish ambassador in Paris, and I strongly believe we need a consulate after that review in France as well, somewhere in the south. It's such a big country and it's so vitally important to our future diplomatic efforts within Europe. And I think overall, the amount we invest in terms of people, money and resources into our embassies across the EU, it has shown in the last couple of years how good an investment that is, and it's time we need to double down on that investment. We really need to strengthen our diplomatic footprint, not just around the world, and I'm enthused to see us opening embassies in Chile and consulates in Vancouver and everything else, but I think we have to look after Europe first, and I think there's great scope for us to increase that. And within that outreach, I was just wondering, was there any discussions at GAC in relation to your recent work in the Western Balkans and looking at future partners and potential future members, particularly the events as they relate to, I think it's officially now Northern Macedonia and everything that's going on there. And finally, it's very hard not to mention the B word, but we are 37 days away from it, increasingly worrying. And I appreciate your comments in relation to the preparedness and the legislation. I know I was here on Thursday with others where we got a really good briefing from the Taoiseach, and look forward to welcoming you into the Seanad Chamber prior to St Patrick's Day in order, well, hopefully we don't get there, to be honest. I actually really hope I don't have to welcome you into the Chamber, but if needs be. And I was just wondering, particularly at your discussions yesterday, Minister, what were the discussions in terms of comparison? I know that the French and the Dutch have taken a very different approach to the Irish government in relation to allowing ministers far more direct powers to prepare for a no-deal scenario. But what was maybe the Commission's opinion on the work that has been done domestically by the Irish government in relation to preparedness? And also, maybe, and it might be a little less detailed, can you possibly outline the mood at GAC? You know, outline the mood. What are our 26 partners in the European countries? What are their thoughts on the unfolding absolute disaster that we see in Westminster at the moment? Is the solidarity with Ireland still strong? I have no doubt that it is, Minister, but I think it's very, very important that we relay that and we continuously stress that we are a European Union of 27 member states who are sticking together right until the last minute, despite the concerns or indeed outlandish desires of certain people in our commentariat. Thank you very much, Chair.
Senator Gerard Crockwell, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. I agree with much of what my colleague has just spoken to you about, but I'd like to come back home, if I may, Minister. And in 2016, the day after the referendum, I wrote a piece on the re-establishment of a border on this island. And at the time, it was scoffed at by many as an impossibility. It's not quite so impossible now. And I would like to know, firstly, what steps have the government taken to bring back the corporate knowledge that we have lost since roughly 1998, 1999, in particular to bring back customs people who worked the border at that time, who understand how it is, to train some of those 400 that you have coming forward. The Garda stations that we've closed over the years, there is no Defence Force location anywhere between Donegal and Dundalk. So Cavan and Monaghan, are we carrying out reconnaissance to find locations where soldiers can be accommodated in the event of a border being put in place? Now, language is everything when we're talking about the future of our relationship with Northern Ireland, and I deeply resent the term hard border. There was never a hard border on the island of Ireland, not since the foundation of the state. There has been a highly militarised border and a border that was managed with checkpoints, but there was never a hard border on this island. And when we talk about a hard border coming forward, are we considering putting in a hard border, which means to take a Trumpism, building the wall? Because I don't see that happening. I see us going back to the type of border that we had, which is a managed border, which will require physical presence at approved crossings. It will require, once we put a physical presence in place, it will require Garda Síochána and it will require Defence Force personnel. And I wonder, has that even been war-gamed at this stage? Have we any idea where we stand there? The next issue for me is the issue of funding. My colleague, Senator Richmond, mentioned it to a certain degree. We had two groups in last week in the Good Friday Committee, and they are particularly concerned about the mismatch of funding that will take place in a post-Brexit situation, even if it's a soft Brexit. We will still have European money coming to the southern counties, we expect, through the various programmes that are in place. But what steps have been taken to guarantee that the British will match pound per euro to ensure that we have funding on the north side? The other issues that have come up, the unity of Europe, much play is made about the unity of Europe and how we're all in this together. But Europe is, as one famous investor put it, I think they called the guy Soros, he said, Europe is likely to catastrophically collapse in a situation worse than the Soviet Union. And he points to the various things that are happening around Europe, yellow vests in France, right wing in Italy, Poland and Hungary deviance within the system. How sure are we that the solidarity we talk about will remain in place in the event of a crash out? And I have two final points. One is the issue of the border poll, and I see those that advocate for a border poll are not here, which is a pity, because I would like to see that is put out of the discussion firmly by the government. What we want is we want communities in Northern Ireland to live together in harmony and to trade and work with people in the south of Ireland. A border poll is a long, long way away. And the final one I have is that Senator Richmond's committee has set up for a number of meetings in early March in the north of Ireland, and very wise of him, he has included civic groups from the Unionist and from the Nationalist community, and I know I've spoken to Neil on this myself. There is a growing civic voice in the north of Ireland that is neither nationalist nor unionist. It is ordinary citizens concerned for their future, regardless to which way it goes, whether it's a crash-out Brexit or a hard Brexit. But they need a voice. They want a voice. And I wonder, have we, the Irish government, looked at a way that we might give them a voice in order that their concerns can be raised right across Ireland, firstly, and secondly, across Europe? Because, sadly, the voice from Northern Ireland that we're hearing at the moment is the voice of one side and one side only down here. And it doesn't necessarily reflect the feeling on the ground. Chairman, thank you very much. I'm sorry if I went on a bit.
No, thank you very much, Senator. And I just want to also, of course, welcome everybody that's here in the public gallery and to recognise Deputy Charlie McConagulog and his guests for being here today. Thank you. So, Deputy Bernard Durkan. Durkan, please.
Chairman, I thank the Minister for State for coming before us again and being forthright in the information made available to us. Yes, I think just 2 or 3 quick things, if I might, please. The direct access to the continent post-Brexit from the point of view of Irish exporters by way of Rosslare or other ports. Some questions have been raised as to whether or not it might not be so easy to do. I don't see any logistical reason at all why that cannot happen. And the question I'm asking really is, do we have enough investment provisions put in place to ensure that Irish hauliers can get directly onto the continent as quickly as possible, thus bypassing the need to cross over into the UK? With the obvious delays that might occur. I would also, in relation to the 300 million future growth loan scheme, to what extent has that been accessed or is being accessed by the various businesses throughout the country? And is it working satisfactorily, or is it going to work satisfactorily? And has sufficient evidence been gleaned at this stage to determine that? I would, in reference to the CAP, I think is important that we recognise it. There's been a sort of a revision in recent times, to the effect that really agricultural production should be scaled down to meet other requirements and so on and so forth, which I think it's possible to maintain both the agricultural production and meeting carbon reduction requirements without damaging the agricultural sector. And the point I would make there and emphasise, Chairman, is this, is that there are thousands of people, including children, all over the globe at the present time, dying of starvation. So that one of the things that we must recognise, that if we're to be realistic about it, we should ensure that sufficient food is produced to ensure that we can do our part, make our contribution towards alleviating that ongoing starvation and threat. And to move over to my colleague, Senator Crockwell, I think we need to be careful about setting up provision along creating a border. We've got to be awfully careful that we don't create a border ourselves. The position we've been forced into at the present time is that the UK, by virtue of its diplomatic provisions, is effectively abolishing the Good Friday Agreement, which is an extraordinary thing, and all that it stood for. A solemn agreement written and acceded to by several countries, by the United States, and people who made major contributions to it, United States, Canada, the European Union, and all to be set aside to follow a particular path, drawn up a political path that nobody seems to understand is going in any particular direction. And it saddens me to see that an eminent body like the United Kingdom, powerful country, should see fit to set aside a solemn agreement of the nature of the Good Friday Agreement, because that's effectively what's been attempted at the present time. And I just would ask, in relation to that, is this being? I know that it is. Are they being reminded of the seriousness of this, because it will have serious consequences for Europe, serious consequences for Ireland South and Ireland North. The other thing I would mention is this: is that we need to be absolutely certain that we don't do that work for them by creating, saying, this is inevitable, we must do it. Nothing is inevitable, and we mustn't do it. The fact is that they decided what they wanted to do. They're pursuing this. They have other options as well, of course. Far be it from me to try to tell our neighbours what they should do, but they could go back and have another referendum. They say they can't. They won't. It's sacrosanct. Well, it's as sacrosanct as everything else is sacrosanct when it comes to negotiations. They could. So what are they afraid of? Are they afraid it might go the opposite direction? Which is, I would certainly be of that opinion. And it is so sad and worrying to see that we, in this stage of our development, that a European country, major European player, continues in the same direction, notwithstanding the indications from the business and investment sectors that they are concerned, and some moving out and others expressing deep concern, and the potential disastrous consequences on an ongoing basis. Last point is in relation to Europe's cohesiveness, and we welcome and thank our European colleagues for their solid support, because without that there'd be no sense in having any discussions at all. There would be no European Union either, and that's something we need to remember. If the European Union starts to fragment, one brick on the wall, one brick out of that wall, and the European concept was thought up by people when Europe lay in flames and in ashes. And it was constructed in such a way as to ensure that we didn't suffer starvation, as we did in the past, and that we didn't suffer from a war as a result of the member states, our member states of the European Union, deciding to take offence at each other and decide to wage a war. It was well thought out. And the people who thought that out had forged their opinions from the very harsh reality of the 1939 to 45 experience, which should never be visited again, and everything possible needs to be done to ensure that it doesn't. And remember this: there are those who will dismiss all these possibilities and say, not at all, that's never likely to happen again. Wrong. Man's inhumanity to man goes on forever, Mr. Chairman, has never been known to be surpassed until the next time comes along, and then it gets worse. So I would just say this, Mr. Chairman, that I believe that we have a role to play in what lies ahead. I think we have done well by our European colleagues. I think our European colleagues have done well by us in the most recent times, and it now remains to see what prevails for hereinafter.
Thank you very much, Deputy Senator Terry Leydon.
Thank you very much, Garlick. First of all, I'd like to welcome Minister Helen McEntee, Minister for European Affairs, and staff here today. To the ambassadors and embassy staff, very welcome. I must say I commend the embassies for always having members here to listen to the contributions at this meeting. I just start off by actually disagreeing with Bernard Durkan as far as the Good Friday Agreement is concerned. As far as I'm concerned, from our discussions, the Good Friday Agreement stands, irrespective of the exit from the European Union. And all the institutions within that, the British Irish Parliamentary Assembly, the Assembly of Ministers, will continue post-Brexit. That's a fact. It's an international agreement signed and it's registered in the United Nations. So what I say is that under the Good Friday Agreement, we must continue to develop and expand our relationship with our nearest neighbour, United Kingdom. And we can do that through, the Minister mentioned, our meetings, our committee meeting here, our Joint Committee on European Affairs, I believe, would be willing and able to continue with bilateral discussions at the highest level in the House of Commons and House of Lords. And that was something I would certainly aspire to from the work of this committee in the future. because we have such a relationship, and with such Irish people in the United Kingdom, with the free movement, travel, with a lot of things which will continue post-Brexit. So let's have a positive note in that particular regard. And the influence of Irish in Britain is enormous and will be vital after Brexit. I see no appetite for another referendum. I think it's aspirational, it is pie in the sky. From what discussions meeting British people, they're quite war-weary as far as Brexit is concerned, and they're quite weary with the House of Commons and the debates that are going on and the defections and new groups being formed. They just want to get a finality to this situation as quickly as possible. So the deadline for the 29th of March stands. I want to compliment the Minister herself and her officials and the Taoiseach Minister for Foreign Affairs, who briefed us here last week on the, myself and Senator Richmond were here. We got a very good briefing on the amount of legislation, about 92 pages, one legislative composite bill covering all departments. And the Minister and Taoiseach made it quite clear that this bill would be an all-party bill to the extent that he wants an input from all parties, independents and all parties, when this bill is going through the Dáil and then going through the Seanad. There will be a unity of purpose among members to ensure that the bill is very, very comprehensive, which it is, but also will cover areas that may not have been considered at this point in time. And I can assure, from the Seanad point of view and from the Fianna Fáil parliamentary point of view, we are very anxious to ensure that these bills are passed on schedule, on time, in advance of the decision. Now, if something happens, though, that bill will be put on ice until Britain leaves. So it's a comprehensive insurance policy, basically, on the basis of Brexit on the 29th of March for the United Kingdom. The post-Brexit, there would be time for discussions and negotiations in relation to what will happen. But I think that angles are covered very well. For instance, Durkan mentioned the land bridge. Well, that is protected, provided you send a product from Ireland straight to Europe through the land bridge. That will not be inspected under international agreement at the moment. But the important thing is that we would have a fast track of European Union goods coming from Ireland straight to Europe, to have a fast track and to ensure that the British government will cooperate, that we would have that extra lane that will be dedicated to European Union traffic going through the land bridge in the United Kingdom. And it's in their interest as well that we continue those exports through the United Kingdom. Just finally, in relation to the travel situation regarding motorists between north and south, I think the insurance companies have indicated that they will be providing a green card, or whatever they like to call it, a pass. But I think it would be very honourable for them to issue that to all drivers, whether you travel to the north frequently or not frequently, but allow anyone that would be travelling there or dropping in through the north-south, which is very easy to do if you're up in Monaghan or elsewhere, you can pass through the north very handily. So I think they should issue this with their customers, and I call on the insurance company I deal with, FPD, to show generosity and spirit. And there's no extra charge in this regard, I understand, but that will be issued after the decision is made to leave the European Union. Finally, in relation to an extension of the Article 50, the danger of that is that if it goes beyond the 29th of March, now you're into the European election situation, and the rights of the European Britain, United Kingdom, to have candidates in that election would still stand if it goes beyond May the 24th. And the additional seats here in the Republic of Ireland too would actually could not be functioning until that decision was made. There would be an abeyance, actually, if the United Kingdom decides to contest the European elections, which they're entitled to do. So that's just a proviso. And finally, in relation to Hungary, there is deep concern about the suppression of the opposition in Hungary, and I think the European Union should insist that the new opposition party, which is associated with the Fianna Fáil party, ALDE, will be given access to airwaves and radio television.
Thank you very much, Senator. I just want to remind members now the Minister is down to 10 minutes. Deputy Seán Haughey, please.
I think the timetable and the Dáil is slipping, so I say you'll have plenty of time to do your contribution over there. Just to thank the Minister for her comprehensive report, to welcome what you have said in relation to alliance building. Whether we like it or not, the UK was a major ally of the Republic of Ireland in the European Union, and we will miss the UK and their support on a wide range of issues. So to thank you and to encourage you to, in your endeavours in relation to alliance building. There's all sorts of issues of concern to us and other nation states, whether it be in relation to agriculture or taxation or defence or whatever. So I welcome the solidarity, and I welcome the work that you are doing with your diplomats in building new alliances following the exit of the UK from the European Union. I'd also like to welcome your remarks in relation to the rule of law. You mentioned that the Union is based on shared values, including democracy, human rights and the rule of law. And I'd like to encourage you in the stance that you have taken, particularly in relation to Poland and Hungary. We have the European Parliament elections coming up in May. There would be concern that the basic values of the European Union may be challenged in those elections. And I hope that citizens will reflect deeply, both in this country and in other nation states, when they come to cast their votes in those elections, of what type of Europe we want to see going forward. In relation to the multi-annual financial framework, can you clarify one issue for me? In the event of a no-deal Brexit, what is the expectation of the British contribution to the European Union going forward? I know that it's provided for in the withdrawal agreement, but what is the expectation should the UK crash out of the European Union? What is the expectation of their contribution to the European Union going forward for the next few years? Just in relation to preparations for Brexit, you spoke about Dublin and Rosslare ports, and that sites suitable for temporary infrastructure have been identified and refurbishment work has begun. Space for truck parking is being secured in both locations. I have a real worry about the Dublin Port Tunnel. As a Northside deputy, there are reports that the Dublin Port Tunnel may have to be closed on occasions if there's backlogs. It's a major piece of transport infrastructure in this city and this country, and if there's any hold-up whatsoever in relation to trucks and traffic moving through that tunnel, it will destroy traffic in the city. It will disrupt it completely. So I would hope that the Line Minister, the Minister for Transport, Tourism and Sport, is very conscious of that, because that's the first thing people will realise when they're stuck in their cars for much longer traffic jams, if there's any trouble in relation to the flow of traffic through the Dublin Port Tunnel, and I hope that's been looked at by those who should be looking at it. And just finally, in relation to the future of Europe, to congratulate you on the work that you did in relation to the citizens' dialogue on the future of Europe, and just to follow up on that. This report that was presented concludes by drawing attention to the summit in Romania, which will prepare the strategic agenda from 2019 to 2024. And it's stated in this document that in advance of this summit, we will publish a statement on our strategic priorities for the European Union. So I'd like to get an up-to-date report on that. Obviously, all the citizens who participated in this citizens' dialogue would like to know where their work has gone and what you intend to do going forward in relation to that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deputy Haughey. Senator Paul Coughlin.
Thank you, Chairman, and welcome, Minister, and thank you for your contribution and your ongoing good work. I just want to touch briefly on two things. The 80% or more of our exports, which go to continental Europe, do go through Britain and come out travelling Dover, Calais, I understand. Now, what are the arrangements, if any, in the event, as I say, of a no deal? Will those lorries be able to have their own lane to pass on through? Because it looks like there could be a backup of British trucks, maybe well back up towards London. So I'm just wondering, because some of those goods will be perishable or near perishable, and even if we were to develop a sea route going to France, that's going to be a much longer journey, and we obviously haven't the ferries to handle it at the moment anyway. So I think that traffic will have to continue to go through Britain, and I think it's going to be very important that it will have its own arrangements. I agree with Chair Crockle. Talk of border poll is dangerous and it's years away. And look, it's governed by the Good Friday Agreement. And you might just comment on that, Minister, because my understanding is the British government are very firm in their view about the Good Friday Agreement, and they're not proposing that it be set aside whatsoever. And they're very firmly standing over it. You might just briefly comment on that as well. And what do you think of a possibility of an extension of the March 29th deadline? They're my items. Thank you, Chairman.
Okay. Thank you very much, Senator. And could I just say myself, I was very glad to hear of the ambitious programme that was being put together by the government for the Patrick's Week. And it's just coincidental that Patrick's Day is coming when it is coming. I see this as a very sensible way. Do you know the way you get people sometimes in the media, and they knock not just this government but other governments for sending senior ministers and junior ministers around the globe. I actually think that that's desperately good value for money. I believe that it's a very worthwhile programme. When I see ministers, junior and senior, and their officials going out, as far as I'm concerned, every person that takes off, they're ambassadors for our country. We're all flying the same flag, and I think that opposition, independents, government supporting groups, every one of us should be 100% behind that job of work. I really see it being beneficial. This year, more than ever, visiting each of the EU capitals at this critical time, and what I'd call going out there and flying the Irish flag, I think that's such a tremendously important job of work. I don't think its importance could be overemphasised. Using our Irish ambassadors, continuing a strong programme of engagement and work with the ambassadors that are based here in Ireland, and those who actually are covering here but aren't actually even residing here, continuing ongoing engagement with all of those. That is what will take us over the next number of weeks, months and years. And I really think that that should be supported by everybody. And I was so glad to see the government being ambitious and really putting a special effort into Europe this year. I just think that's so important, and I want to recognise that. Minister, I don't want to delay you, so can you...
I'm aware that do we have one deputy or...
No, Deputy Frank, you're...
No.
Yeah, okay.
That's okay, because the Dáil chamber is delayed until 3:45, so we're okay for a bit of... We will have another 45 minutes for grant.
3 o'clock.
That's okay. Well, look, thank you to the deputies and senators, and thank you, Chairman, for your comments. And maybe just to touch on that, I thank you for your support. I think Ireland has a unique opportunity to sell itself, but also to engage with member states, with nations, with countries across the world on St. Patrick's Day, and I really think it's an important opportunity for us to relay the best of what we have to offer in terms of our trade, business, but also culture and so many other key areas as well. So just to thank you for your comments on that. Senator Richmond, firstly in terms of the MFF and the timelines, I suppose initially while this discussion started almost 2 years ago, there would have been an ambition by the current Commission that it would be concluded and finalised before the European elections, but obviously, as we've seen in previous years and negotiations, it is extremely complex, and the added complexities of Brexit have pushed that out further. So we would agree in terms of trying to have a finalised political decision made by October. Obviously, there is engagement already happening with the European Parliament on specific areas or specific sectors or industries, but what we would hope is when that is agreed then in October and in the autumn time, that would then be passed on to the Parliament, obviously, where they would work on it also, and obviously it would have to be agreed. I myself have met with the chair of the Budget Committee from the Parliament and many others on this as well, so there's constant engagement at various different levels on the MFF. In terms of the Erasmus programme, but obviously just to say I think it's important that we do try and conclude it within a timely manner. The last MFF, a number of programmes were delayed in their starting because of the delay in agreeing the final overall budget, so it's important that we get it done on time. In terms of Erasmus and many other programmes, I absolutely agree with the Deputy. I think we need to highlight it more, and also the fact that Erasmus is not just for third level students, that it also now applies to those who are in traineeships, who are working in voluntary community organisations, those who are in primary school, secondary school, and there are so many more opportunities available. So I think it's important that we, through our educational platforms, but otherwise highlight the opportunities that are available. When we carried out the Future of Europe discussions throughout the country, the one thing that people highlighted and which became clear to us in the discussions was that a lot of what Europe is doing people weren't aware of, and that we need to communicate better. And so in that regard, as part of our overall discussion and our presentation that we'll make to the Council meeting in Sibiu on the 9th of May, we've started engaging with all of our departments, and that would include the Department of Education and others, to identify how they could better communicate their own connections with Europe, or what it is that people can benefit through European programmes like Erasmus Plus and others, and we've had engagement already and hope to have further engagement with departments on that. Senator Richmond, in terms of the rule of law in Hungary, and I suppose what are the sanctions, we have to adhere to the process that is currently there. What we've seen in terms of the engagement with Poland is that we have seen results in certain areas. We have seen changes reversed, or we have seen new legislation introduced on the basis of the hearings that we've had. As I've said, I myself have contributed to 5 different hearings engaging with our Polish colleagues and the Commission, and I think we need to allow that process to take place for Hungary as well. This is obviously something which was presented to the Council through the European Parliament. There was an initial discussion as to how that in itself would be brought forward, because this was new, but I think following on from yesterday's discussion, the current presidency has said that this will continue to be an issue, that we must continue to raise it, and as I said myself yesterday, there are concerns there, but of course Hungary has asked for fair process and due process to be able to address questions that people have raised, and people certainly do have questions. In terms of the alliances, you know, many have mentioned this, we are losing one of our closest neighbours, friends, allies in terms of the UK, and of course we want to continue to be able to work with them on key issues, but when it comes to the European Council, the General Affairs, the Agricultural Committees, whatever it is our ministers will be attending, they will not be around the table, and so it's important that we do have other alliances, whether it's in terms of financial issues, tax, the next MFF, agricultural issues, or indeed the digital single economy. In terms of the D9 group that's set up, we are actively engaged in various different groups, but also discussions with member states from across the whole of the European Union, and I think it's extremely important that we continue that, and where we can find commonalities, that we work with each other at the same time without creating any divisions between the European Union and its member states. In terms of the Western Balkans, and again I think it is extremely important that we continue to show support for those member states looking to join the European Union. While one member state is unfortunately looking to leave, there are many others who see the European Union as the way forward and as a way for their country to develop and to prosper and to grow, and particularly their young people. Last year I travelled to Albania, Serbia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Montenegro, and this year Albania and North Macedonia. And what is very clear is that if the European Union does not continue to engage and to open up a process for those member states to move along the path to accession, then other countries and other regions will, and obviously we need to make sure that we continue that engagement. My visit to the Western Balkans this year was with my Finnish colleague, and I think it's important that we don't just, as individual member states, develop those relationships, but also that we work together to show unity from the European Union as a whole. In terms of Brexit discussions, the Commission's thoughts on where we are, what we're doing, the general mood. I think the general mood is that of frustration at the moment, to be honest. The Commission's thoughts on what we are doing and where we are as a country, I think the Commission is continuing to encourage all Member States to prepare in the best way that they can. Obviously the work that we are doing is not necessarily what other Member States need to do, but we are trying to make sure, in as much as we can, everything that we do is in parallel with the work that the Commission is doing, and so there is constant engagement to make sure that we are working in parallel, and that anything that they are working on we can then replicate here where we need to also. In terms of Senator Craughwell, what steps have been taken in terms of customs? Obviously, the officials that have been hired in terms of the East-West and the possible complications in terms of freight transport or having to provide documentation which wasn't there before. I think most importantly our focus is ensuring that businesses are prepared and are able to actually have the documentation and to prepare in that way. In that regard, Revenue have been taking part in an outreach programme more recently since the central case planning has been ramped up to implementation of a no-deal scenario, and they are engaging with small and medium enterprises but also have engaged with a significant number of larger companies well to make sure that they have the correct expertise and knowledge to be able to deal with any of these possible changes that may happen. And I think what's important to stress is that even in a deal scenario there will be some additional paperwork required and some changes to the way that people are doing business. So it's important that they avail of this irrespective of whether they feel there's going to be a deal or a no deal, because it will be important either way. In terms of sending soldiers or identifying places for posts, this is simply not happening and not something that we are considering. We're not considering anything in terms of a wall or otherwise, and we have consistently said that and consistently repeated that there is an onus on the UK to fulfil its obligations as co-guarantors of the Good Friday Agreement, and the invisible border that currently exists is integral to the Good Friday Agreement and it being successful or continuing to be successful. In terms of funding, the mismatch of funding in Brexit in terms of peace and interreg or communities in the north, of course that is a significant challenge. If the UK were to leave without a deal, we do not know whether or not, and this comes back maybe to the funding on the question on the MFF and what would happen next. We would have to find out from the UK as to what funding they wanted to continue to pay. Obviously, the Prime Minister has been clear that there are certain programmes they want to leave, whether it's CAP or the Common Fisheries Policy, but there are other areas that they have consistently stated they wanted to remain a part of, peace and interreg being one of them, and they have already given a commitment to continue that funding and co-funding with Ireland and the European Union, but also in terms of Erasmus, in terms of Horizon 2020, in terms of social and educational programmes. So really, until we hear from the UK as to what it is that they would be continuing to fund or not, then obviously it's very hard to identify where the gaps might or might not be. But obviously we will continue to fund the Peace and Interreg programme and any other programmes that require a cross-party or cross-North-South support. In terms of solidarity within the EU, support is strong from all Member States. As I said, I think there is a frustration, but there is certainly clarity from all of my colleagues that I've spoken to as recently as yesterday that the withdrawal agreement must remain as is, that the backstop, the Irish protocol and the issues discussed in terms of financial settlement and citizens' rights cannot be reopened, but obviously there is an opportunity to focus on the future relationship and possible changes to that. I think it's also important to mention, because Senator Craughwell mentioned maybe the European elections coming up and solidarity being strong, but that there are, I suppose, different fractions within European Member States that are possibly moving more towards the left or right. Any colleague I have engaged with and asked in terms of the Future of Europe discussions, in terms of support for the European Union, I haven't heard any say that support is less than 60% in any Member State, while obviously ours is quite high at 90%. Most Member States are 60, 70 or 80% supportive of the European Union, and I think through that engagement and through the process on the Future of Europe, we can only hopefully increase that number in all Member States, including Ireland as well. In terms of a border poll, again, I'd want to reiterate what Senator Craughwell has said. It's not the time for a border poll. It's certainly not on this government's agenda, and it's not going to be in terms of the overall discussions that we're having, whether there is a deal or a no deal. Civic groups from the Unionist and Nationalist community, I suppose that the question was in terms of people feeling that they don't have representation. The best way to address that is for there to be a functioning executive for the Northern Ireland Assembly, which is 2 years and 1 month a world record for a region not to be or to be without a government. It is extremely important that that executive is up and running, and that groups like the Ulster Farmers Union, like Retail Northern Ireland, like the various different groups that have come out in support of the withdrawal agreement, that they feel that they have a voice as well. Deputy Durkan, in terms of your question, do we have enough investment in place for hauliers? Do we have enough investment in place for hauliers? Again, I suppose to go back to my initial statement, we are investing in as much as we can to ensure that at our own ports that the facilities and the space and the mechanisms are in place, whether it's people working, obviously customs officials or SPS checks, or else the space that we need in terms of lay-bys or expanding the overall parameters of the various different ports. What we cannot predict and what we don't know is in terms of those who continue through the land bridge in the UK as to what the impact will be on them. We can prepare on our own ports. We can also engage with our European colleagues, which we have done from France and Belgium, being the two main ones, to try and ensure that when Irish trucks arrive, that they might perhaps have a faster lane or a specific lane to drive through. However, we have no such commitment or communication in terms of the UK, and I would find it very difficult to believe that Irish hauliers would have a quicker pass through the Channel Tunnel than the UK hauliers, and that's obviously one of the biggest challenges that we face. Of course, we are also ensuring that even in a no-deal scenario, there is a reciprocal arrangement which would ensure that UK hauliers could continue to travel through the EU, and obviously that would work vice versa. But again, that's not going to replace what we currently have. It's not going to be as good as the status quo. So that is the biggest challenge that we face. But we are working with hauliers who really are at the front line in terms of a lot of the chains that we talk about, and it's important that they understand what supports are available to them and what is happening. The 300 million Brexit loan scheme fund, my understanding at the moment is as of the 28th of January, 338 firms have been approved. This is ranging across departments or business, from the agri-food sector, retail, distribution, manufacturing, we have hospitality, transport sector, and we have a further 36 applications which are currently being processed. This is to the value of 15.34 million have already been sanctioned, so obviously there is still a substantial amount of funding there, but in that regard I would encourage companies who feel that this is something that they need to avail of to apply, and obviously we're trying to move these along as quickly as possible. There are other supports available as well, and at a European level, Minister Heather Humphreys has been given permission from the Commission in terms of a rescue and restructuring fund to work with the European or with Enterprise Ireland, which would again provide further support for small and medium enterprises who are currently feeling that their business and the survival of their business is at threat. There's a second one then where it isn't as severe, but where that additional support can be and ceilings can be lifted by Enterprise Ireland. In terms of CAP, again, you mentioned food security. Absolutely. We have consistently stated our position in terms of the next MFF. That is why we have consistently said that we would be willing to pay the 1.1% instead of the 1% proposed by the Commission at the moment. But obviously we would want to ensure that our traditional priorities are protected, and that includes CAP. But also, as you have mentioned, this is not just for our own farmers and our own Indigenous industry, which is extremely important. This is about food security, this is about food hygiene, this is about health, and I think we have a real opportunity now in terms of how we connect that with our discussion on research and innovation, but also climate change, and how our own farmers here have been and can continue to be champions of change in all of those areas, and to continue to produce food in the most sustainable way as they always have done. In terms of the UK, are they being reminded of the seriousness of the Good Friday Agreement? Absolutely. While it's not for us to interfere in the political process in the UK, and we have not, it is within our right, I believe, to remind them of their obligations as co-guarantors of the Good Friday Agreement, and we continue to do that in every way that we can. Again, in terms of European support, absolutely steadfast. I believe it's very strong. And again, yes, it's clear to see yesterday, while we might disagree on certain issues and we might disagree on certain processes, the solidarity on this particular issue and the unity of the EU27 has been very strong. Senator Layden, in terms of the Good Friday Agreement and its standing irrespective of Brexit, absolutely, I agree with that, and I think we need to continue to develop the relationships that we've had. That's why our ministers are continuing to engage with UK ministers, albeit separate to the Brexit negotiations, which are being handled by Michel Barnier and his team at a European level. It's fair to say that relationships are somewhat strained, which is, I think, only natural when a negotiation is underway. But we have been very clear that we want the progress that we have made in recent years in our relationship to continue, and that obviously post-Brexit we will continue to use the ways and means which we have already through our various different committees and formats to continue that engagement, and possibly those committees formed from the Good Friday Agreement could be used as a way of engaging when they are now not around the table at the Council meetings. The bill we of course wanted to pass in time, and we thank all of the deputies and all parties for their support on that, and obviously we will do everything we can to ensure that it is implemented on time, and if it's not needed for the 29th of March, then it will of course be there for when it is needed. In terms of goods, I just need to see the question. Again, I suppose this comes back to our hauliers and being able to ensure that goods can get to the EU as quickly as possible. The Department of Transport has done a huge amount of work in terms of the sea transport. We have a new vessel, the WB Yates, which has been launched, which can now carry 3 times the amount as its predecessor, which obviously is significant. But at the same time, when you have certain perishable goods that can only be delivered or that need a 20-hour turnaround time, as opposed to others that maybe could work within the 40 or 60-hour turnaround time, depending on the boat in question, then obviously the land bridge is going to be the quickest. But it goes back to then the challenge we face in terms of what happens when they get to the UK. But we're doing everything we can to try and address that. The Article 50 extension, again, this is something the Prime Minister as recently as last week has said that she's not going to ask for, and until they ask for that, obviously we can't predict what will happen there. Of course, if they do, we have always said we would look upon it favourably, but I think, again, speaking to colleagues in the last few days, our EU colleagues and the Commission would want to know that there is a reason as to why there's going to be an extension, and obviously that we're not going to end up in the same place as we are now, but in 3 months' time, prolonging the uncertainty for so many businesses and people. Again, the green card, this is something that insurance companies are taking on board based on what was previously in place prior to membership of the European Union. My understanding is that they will begin to engage with all of their customers at the beginning of March if a deal has not been agreed to or if we have not seen progress. And obviously it's additional paperwork. It's not what people want to be doing, but it's obviously a contingency plan that's in place. Again, Hungary, we will continue to engage on that and continue to voice our concerns on the many different issues, whether it's the voluntary or community organisations that have been impacted, we feel, by the recent legislation, whether it's the universities' move now being situated in Vienna or the courses having to take place in Vienna, or obviously the developments in recent times of the government-funded campaign against the President of the European Commission. Deputy Haughey, again, continue to alliance build. As I've set out, we have, through our various different engagements, whether it's on the MFF, the digital agenda, the agricultural ministers, or else the finance and taxation issues, we are continuing to engage, but also on a one-to-one basis, and that's why I'll be travelling to Lithuania and Latvia next week. That's why the Taoiseach will continue his engagement across all of the European member states. The rule of law in Poland, you specifically mentioned, will continue in the way that we have, but obviously I think there is a frustration that this process has been ongoing for some time now, and while we have seen significant developments, not enough progress has been made in certain areas. So this is something that we need to work together on to try and see, I think, a conclusion sooner rather than later. MFF in the event of a no deal, again, the contribution from the UK and what that would look like, we will have to wait and see what that would be the case, whether they would continue to pay even the event of a no-deal scenario. In terms of the future of Europe, Sibiu, Romania, the event on the 9th of May. We hope to publish that in April, and I would also hope that there would be a debate in the Dáil so that everybody would be able to, and the Senate, everybody would be able to engage in it, contribute to it before this is then presented by the Taoiseach on the 9th of May. Deputy Coughlan, then again, in terms of, I suppose this is, I don't want to repeat myself, but again, in terms of the hauliers and ensuring that our exports to the EU reach the EU in as quick a time as possible. Obviously, we're doing everything, as I've just outlined, from the work on our ports to engaging with our EU colleagues to additional ships to various other ways as well. We're trying to engage on that. The likelihood of an extension, again, that the UK have not said that they are going to ask for it, so unless they do, it's very hard to deal with that. And I think that's it.
Thank you very much, Minister. First of all, again, the timing of today's briefing from yourself is very important, and we wish you well over the next couple of weeks. And we thank you for your engagement with us here today. And I just believe it's important to carry on strong dialogue here, at home and abroad at all times. And hopefully we'll get over the next couple of months. So could I just say that we'll allow 4 minutes for the Minister to leave, and when we'll return, we'll be in private session, but the meeting now stands suspended.